The war had lasted 11 years, 11 years of burning ships, dying soldiers, and worlds turned to ash. On one side stood the Valoran Queendom, an empire of 32 star systems ruled by a species that lived for centuries, built cities out of light, and believed themselves to be the highest form of life in the galaxy. On the other side stood humanity. Shorter lives, smaller bodies, but a stubbornness that no amount of firepower had managed to kill. The battles had grown worse with each passing year. Valorans had better technology. Their ships were faster, their weapons more advanced, and their soldiers were trained from birth, but humans adapted. They learned, they fought in ways that Valorans never expected, messy, unpredictable, and terrifyingly creative. What was supposed to be a quick conquest had turned into a bleeding wound that neither side could close. By the 11th year, both civilizations were exhausted. It was the neutral Orali conquered that finally stepped in. The Orali were a peaceful species, thin and gray-skinned, who had no army and no desire for one. They had watched the war from a safe distance, and now they offered to mediate. Both sides, too tired to refuse, agreed to meet. The peace talks were held on a station floating in neutral space. Valoran diplomats arrived in silk robes and golden armor. Human diplomats arrived in wrinkled suits with coffee stains. They argued for 3 weeks straight. Every proposal was rejected. Every compromise was torn apart. It seemed like the talks would collapse entirely. Then the Valoran High Council made a demand that no one expected. They wanted a marriage, not just any marriage, a royal one. Queen Sarah of House Draven, ruler of the entire Valoran Queendom, would take a human consort. It was an ancient Valorian tradition. When two great powers could not find peace, through words they bound themselves. Through blood, a shared throne, a shared future. The Valorans believed it was the only way to make the treaty last. The human delegation was stunned. Political marriage between species that had spent a decade trying to destroy each other seemed impossible, but the Valoran Council was firm. No marriage, no peace, and the war would continue. The Terran Coalition, civilian government, held emergency meetings for 4 days. Generals argued, politicians shouted. Some called the demand an insult, others called it an opportunity. In the end, the math was simple. Another decade of war meant millions more dead. A marriage meant one man's life would change forever, but everyone else's children might come home. They agreed. The next question was who. The Valorans had not left this to chance. They had already chosen. They wanted the man who had hurt them the most, not out of revenge, but out of respect. In Valoran culture, you did not bind yourself to the weak. You bound yourself to the strongest enemy you could find, and for the Valoran Queendom, the strongest enemy had a name: Cole Beckett. Cole was not what most people imagine when they heard the words Fleet Admiral. He was 44 years old, average height, with brown hair that was starting to go gray at the edges. He did not give dramatic speeches. He did not pose for cameras. He wore his uniform like it was just clothes, and he spoke so quietly in briefings that officers in the back row had to lean forward to hear him, but his record spoke loud enough. Cole had enlisted at 17 the day after a Valorian strike force burned his home colony to the ground. He had nothing left, no family, no home, no future except the one he built with his own hands. He rose through the ranks not because he was loud or political, but because every unit he commanded survived at higher rates than any other. He was promoted in the field 5 times. He turned down a governorship. He turned down a council seat. He wanted only one thing: to stand between his people and the fire, and he did again and again. He was the man who held the defensive line at Corvan Ridge with 4 damaged frigates against 60 Valoran warships. He was the man who designed the Black Line Protocol, the defensive strategy that saved Earth's inner colonies from falling. Every major Valoran defeat in the last 6 years could be traced back to a plan that came from his mind. Valorans had given him a name in their own language, Shavrath. It meant the one who does not move. His own soldiers had a simpler name for him. They called him the Quiet Wall. When the Terran coalition told Cole he had been selected for the marriage, he was standing on the bridge of his carrier, the Forge of Dawn, reviewing supply reports. He listened to the message without expression. He asked no questions. He sat in silence for a long time. His first officer, a woman named Lieutenant Commander Dana Hall, watched him carefully. She had served with Cole for 9 years. She had seen him face impossible odds without blinking, but this was different. This was not a battle he could plan his way out of. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly. His eyes were tired, the kind of tired that sleep could not fix. "How many people did we lose at Corvan Ridge?" he asked. Dana hesitated. 126. "And at Velmos? 890. He nodded slowly. "If me going there means those numbers stop, then it's not even a choice." Dana wanted to argue. She wanted to tell him that he had given enough. No one had the right to ask this of him, that he deserved something better than being traded away like a piece on a board. But she knew him too well. Once Cole decided something was the right thing to do, no force in the galaxy could change his mind. The announcement was made the following day. Fleet Admiral Cole Beckett would travel to the Valoran throne world of Afara to wed Queen Sarah and seal the peace between their species. The galaxy reacted with shock. Humans felt uneasy. Their greatest protector sent into the heart of enemy territory. Valorans were divided. Some saw it as justice, others as contamination. Cole packed a single duffel bag. He took his service knife, a change of clothes, and a small photograph, old and creased, of a woman and a boy standing in front of a house that no longer existed. He told no one the photograph was. He put it in the bottom of the bag and zipped it shut. On the morning of his departure, the crew of the Forge of Dawn lined the corridors of the ship. They did not cheer. They did not salute. They simply stood shoulder to shoulder and watched him walk. Some of them had tears on their faces. Cole looked straight ahead, his duffel over one shoulder, his boots echoing on the metal floor. He reached the shuttle bay. He stepped inside the small diplomatic transport. The door closed behind him. He did not look back. The shuttle lifted off, cleared the carrier's hangar, and turned toward Valoran space. Through the viewport, the stars stretched and blurred as the engines engaged. Somewhere ahead, on a world he had spent a decade trying to destroy, a queen was waiting, and Cole Beckett, the quietest man in the fleet, flew toward her alone. The throne world of Afara was beautiful in a way that made Cole feel like he did not belong. The cities were built from a pale stone that caught the light of 3 distant suns, and scattered it into soft rainbows. Towers rose in impossible curves, thin as needles held together by engineering that human scientists still did not fully understand. The air smelled like rain and something sweet that Cole could not name. Everything was elegant, everything was precise, everything was designed to remind visitors that the Valorans had been building civilizations while humans were still figuring out fire. Cole stepped off the shuttle onto a landing platform made of polished white crystal. A welcoming party waited for him, 12 Valorian officials in formal robes, their silver skin catching the light, their amber eyes watching him the way a cat watches a bird. None of them smiled. The tallest of them stepped forward. She was a woman with sharp features and dark silver hair pulled back tightly. Her name was Lady Nith, and she was the Queen's most trusted advisor. She looked down at Cole, literally, since she stood nearly 7 ft tall, and studied him for a long, uncomfortable moment. You are smaller than your war record suggested, she said. Cole looked up at her calmly. Most things are, he said. Nath blinked. She had expected anger or nervousness, or at least some attempt to impress. She got none of it. She turned without another word and led him into the palace. The royal palace of Ara was not a building, it was a city within a city, a vast complex of halls, gardens, bridges, and towers that had been growing for over 6,000 years. Every queen added to it, every generation left its mark. Walking through it felt like walking through time itself. Cole was given quarters in the eastern wing. They were small by Valoran standards. Single room with a narrow bed, a desk, and a window that looked out over a courtyard. It was clearly a message. He was a guest, but not an honored one. He was tolerated, not welcomed. He set his duffel bag on the bed, looked around the room, and said nothing. He unpacked his few belongings, placed the creased photograph face down on the desk, and went to find something to eat. The dining hall was where he first felt the full weight of valor and contempt. Nobles sat at long crystal tables, eating food that glowed faintly with bioluminescence. Conversation stopped when Cole entered. Eyes turned toward him, whispers started behind raised hands. A few nobles openly stared with expressions that needed no translation. Cole picked up a tray, took whatever food was available, sat at an empty table, and ate quietly. The food was strange, soft, almost liquid, textures with flavors that shifted as he chewed. Some of it burned the back of his throat. He did not flinch. He did not make a face. He ate every bite, cleaned his tray, and left. Lady Nith watched from across the hall. She had been assigned to monitor him, to report his every move to the Queen. She had expected the human to crack quickly, to complain about the food, to demand better quarters, to make some kind of scene that would prove what the court already believed, that humans were crude, graceless creatures unworthy of this alliance. Instead, she watched a man who moved through hostility like water flowing around a stone. He did not fight it, he did not react to it. He simply continued. Over the next several days, Cole learned the routines of the court. He woke early, he walked the palace grounds alone, studying the gardens, the architecture, the way the Valorans moved and spoke. He began learning their language, not from classes or tutors, but by listening. He sat in public spaces, quietly absorbing words and grammar, practicing under his breath when no one was close. On his fourth day, he addressed a servant in broken but recognizable Valoran. The servant, a young woman named Pella, froze in surprise. No human had ever spoken to her in her own language. Cole asked her name, then asked if she could tell him the name of the flowering tree in the courtyard. Pella stammered out an answer. Cole repeated the word carefully, thanked her, and walked away. Pella told 3 other servants by midday. By evening, the story had reached the kitchens, the guard barracks, and Lady Nurth's ears. He asked her name. Nareth reported to the Queen. Queen Sarah sat on a low couch in her private chambers, reviewing trade documents she did not look up. Whose name? A servant girl. He spoke to her in Valoran. Sarah paused. Her pen hovered above the page. He speaks Valoran poorly, Nareth admitted, but he is learning quickly. Sarah returned to her documents. He is performing, trying to win sympathy. Nth hesitated. She had watched Cole for 4 days straight. She had seen every meal he ate, every corridor he walked, every moment of silence he endured. She was not sure what she had seen was performance. It looked more like patience, the deep practice patience of a man who had spent a lifetime waiting in hard places. But she said nothing more. The Queen had not asked for her opinion. Meanwhile, in the shadows of the Valoran military command, a different conversation was taking place. War Commander Draven stood before a holographic map of the border systems. He was enormous, even by Valoran standards, 8 feet tall, broad-shouldered, with skin the color of dark iron. He had commanded the Valoran Third Fleet for 15 years. He had lost 2 major engagements to Cole Beckett personally. He carried those defeats like open wounds. This marriage is a disease, Draven said to the officers gathered around him. His voice was deep and hard, like stones grinding together. The Queen has invited the enemy into our house. She has put a human beside the throne of Ara. The officers shifted uncomfortably. Some agreed. Others were less certain. The treaty is signed, one of them said carefully. The council approved it, Draven snapped. The council approved surrender. They dressed it in silk and called it peace. But I know what it is, and I know what must be done. He turned back to the map. His eyes settled on the border systems, the thin, fragile line where Valoran space met Terran space. All it would take was one incident, one spark, and the war would burn again. Draven smiled. It was not a kind smile. Back in the palace, Cole sat on his narrow bed that night, alone. The window was open and strange warm air drifted in, carrying the scent of flowers he did not recognize. He could hear distant music, Valoran instruments playing something slow and sad. The stars outside were different from the ones he knew. Not a single constellation was familiar. He reached into his duffel bag and pulled out the photograph. He looked at it for a long time. The woman in the picture had dark hair and a wide smile. The boy was maybe 5 years old, laughing, holding a toy ship in one hand. Behind them, a small house sat under a blue sky, on a colony world that no longer existed. Cole pressed his thumb against the edge of the photograph, then he put it back in the bag, lay down on the bed, and stared at the ceiling until sleep finally came. The next morning, a formal message arrived at his door. The Queen wished to meet him in the Hall of Resonance. Cole put on his cleanest shirt, straightened his collar and walked toward the heart of the palace. He had faced fleets, survived ambushes, and stared down death more times than he could count, but as he approached the tall, glowing doors of the hall, he felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt nervous. The doors opened. The hall was vast, a cathedral of light, with columns that hummed faintly and a ceiling that reflected the sky outside like a living mirror. At the far end, on a throne carved from a single piece of pale crystal, sat Queen Sailor. She was the most striking being Cole had ever seen. Nearly 7 feet tall, with silver skin that seemed to glow from within. Her hair was white and fell past her shoulders like liquid metal. Her eyes were amber, fractured with veins of gold, and they watched him with an intensity that felt like standing too close to a star. She had expected a brute, a scarred, loud, chest-beating warrior who would try to dominate the room. That was what humans were supposed to be. Instead, she saw a quiet man with tired eyes walking toward her with steady steps. He stopped at the proper distance. She noticed he had learned the correct protocol and bowed. Not deeply, not dramatically, just enough to show respect without surrendering dignity. "Fleet Admiral Cole Beckett," she said. Her voice filled the hall like music played on something ancient. "You are the man they have sent to stand beside me." Cole straightened. He met her eyes without flinching, which was something very few beings in the galaxy could do, and Queen Sarah looked at them directly. "I am he," said simply. The silence between them stretched like a wire pulled tight. Then Sarah nodded once slowly and gestured for him to sit. That evening, after Cole had left, Sarah sat alone in her chambers. She opened a secure file on her data pad, Cole's official war record, the summary version provided by the Terran delegation. She had glanced at it before and dismissed it. Now she read it carefully. She read about Corvon Ridge. 4 frigates, 60 warships. The Valoran fleet had been certain of victory. Cole had used the gravitational pull of a nearby moon to slingshot debris into the Valoran formation, breaking their lines, and then had attacked through the gaps with a precision that should not have been possible for damaged ships with exhausted crews. Sarah set the data pad down. She stared at the wall for a long time. "What manner of creature is this?" she whispered. The room gave her no answer. The wedding was not a celebration, it was a transaction. The ceremony took place in the Temple of Binding, an ancient structure at the very center of the palace complex. Its walls were alive, covered in a bioluminescent moss that pulsed gently, shifting between blue and gold in a rhythm that matched the heartbeat of whoever stood closest to it. When Cole entered, the moss flickered and turned a deep, steady blue. When Sarah entered, it turned gold. Where they stood together at the altar, the two colors met and blurred into something green and uncertain. The temple was filled with Valoran nobles, military commanders, ambassadors from a dozen neutral species, and a small group of human diplomats who sat in the back row, looking like they had accidentally walked into someone else's funeral. Cole wore a formal Valoran robe that had been adjusted poorly for a shorter frame. It dragged slightly at his ankles. He did not seem to notice, or if he did not care. Sarah wore a gown of woven light that moved like water around her tall frame. She looked like something out of a painting. He looked like a man who had been told to stand somewhere and was doing his best. The ceremony lasted 3 hours. It was conducted entirely in Old Valoran, a language so ancient that even most Valorans could not follow every word. But Cole had studied. He repeated his vowels clearly, his pronunciation rough but correct. The priest paused each time, surprised. The audience murmured. No one had expected the human to bother learning the words. When it was done, the priest bound their wrists together with a thin thread of light, a Valorian tradition symbolizing the joining of two lives. The thread glowed for a moment, then faded. Cole looked at Sarah, she looked at him. Neither smiled. They turned and walked out of the temple side by side, and the audience watched them go in heavy silence. There was no reception, no feast, no dancing. The marriage was a political act, and everyone treated it as one. That night Cole returned to his quarters alone. The narrow bed, the small window, the photograph in the bag. Nothing had changed except that, technically, legally, and politically, he was now the consort of the most powerful woman in 32 star systems. He sat on the edge of the bed and let out a long, slow breath. Then he took off the robe, folded it neatly, and went to sleep. The days that followed were quiet and strange. Cole was given a seat on the Queen's Council, but it was a seat in the back row. He was listed in official records as the royal consort, but no one addressed him by title. He attended meetings, listened carefully, and said nothing. The Valoran Council members ignored him the way you might ignore a piece of furniture that someone had placed in an awkward spot. Cole did not seem bothered. He sat, he listened, and he watched. He watched the way the council argued, emotional, loud, driven by honor and pride. He watched the way certain members formed alliances, the way others were isolated. He learned who held real power and who only pretended to. He mapped the politics of the room the same way he had once mapped enemy fleet formations, quietly, patiently, and completely. 3 weeks after the wedding, a crisis arrived. 2 Valoran vassal worlds, Thessa and Kororm, had entered a bitter trade dispute. Thessa controlled a critical supply of medical crystals used in Valoran healing technology. Kororm controlled the shipping lanes needed to transport them. Each world was demanding concessions the other refused to give. The dispute had escalated into threats of economic blockade, and the council had been arguing about it for 2 weeks. Without progress, Cole listened to every argument from his seat in the back. He said nothing during the sessions, but on the 15th day of debate he wrote something on a small piece of paper and passed it quietly to Lady Nath as she walked by. Nith glanced at it. 3 short points written in simple, clear language, a compromise that gave Thessa guaranteed price floor for their crystals, gave Kororm reduced tariffs on the shipping lanes, and created a joint oversight committee from both worlds to manage future disputes. It was elegant in its simplicity. It gave both sides something to win and something to lose, which was the only kind of deal that ever lasted. Nth looked at Cole. He was already looking away, staring at the far wall as if he had not just handed her the solution to a problem that had consumed the council for weeks. She presented the proposal anonymously. The next morning, the council debated it for 2 hours and adopted it by the end of the day. Lady Nareth told no one where it had come from, but she looked at Cole differently after that. A month later, the second incident happened. The orbital shipyards above Ara were the pride of the Valoran fleet, massive structures where warships were built and repaired. One morning an alarm tore through the palace. A reactor in the main shipyard had begun cascading. If it was not stabilized within hours, the resulting explosion could damage half the orbital platform and scatter radioactive debris across the upper atmosphere. Valoran engineers rushed to the scene. They were brilliant, trained for years in the precise science of Valoran reactor technology, but the cascade was behaving strangely. It was not following known patterns. Their models were not working. Hours passed. The temperature climbed. Evacuation orders were being discussed. Cole appeared at the engineering bay without invitation. He had heard the alarm and made his way to the shipyard on a maintenance shuttle, arriving before anyone thought to stop him. He walked into the bay in his plain clothes past a dozen Valoran engineers in full protective gear and looked at the reactor readings on the main display. The lead engineer, a tall woman named Vesa, turned to him in disbelief. "This is a restricted area. You are not qualified to be here." Cole studied the readings for a long moment. "Your containment field is cycling at standard intervals," he said, "but the cascade is pulsing at irregular intervals. The field and the cascade are out of sync. Every time the field pulses, it is actually feeding energy back into the cascade instead of dampening it." Ves stared at him. "How would you know that?" "Because I have seen this before," Cole said. "At the Battle of Velmos, we captured a damaged Valoran cruiser. Its reactor was doing the same thing. Our field engineers figured out that if you offset the containment cycle by 3 seconds, the field catches the cascade on its down pulse instead of its up pulse. It starves instead of feeds." The room was silent. "That is," Vesa began. "Try it," Cole said quietly. "If I am wrong, you lose nothing. If I am right, you save the shipyard." Vesa hesitated. Then she turned to her team and gave the order. 40 minutes later, the reactor was stable. The cascade died like a candle blown out. The temperature dropped. The shipyard was saved. Vesa and her team stood in stunned silence. They had projected a 6-hour fix at minimum. The human had done it in 40 minutes using knowledge he had gained from studying their own captured technology on a battlefield. Cole nodded to them politely, turned and walked out of the engineering bay. Without another word, the story spread through the palace within hours. Servants whispered it, engineers told their colleagues, soldiers and the guard barracks heard it from maintenance crews. The human consort, the quiet man who sat in the back of council meetings and ate alone, had walked into a reactor crisis and solved it faster than their own experts. Lady Nareth brought the full report to Queen Sarah that evening. Sarah read it in silence, then she set it down and did something she had not done before. She opened a secure channel to the Terran Coalition and requested Cole Beckett's full, unredacted military service record. Not the summary, not the version cleaned up for diplomats, the real one. It arrived the next morning, flagged with 17 layers of classification that had been temporarily lifted at the Queen's request. Sarah read it alone in her private study. It took her 4 hours. She learned that Cole had enlisted the day after watching his mother die in the rubble of their colony. She learned that during the evacuation of Marion Station, he had carried wounded civilians on his back through a burning corridor for 3 hours straight. She learned that at the Siege of Calara, he had refused to leave his ship until every escape pod had launched and had been the last person pulled from the wreckage, unconscious. Broken but alive, she learned about the Blackland Protocol. The full details were staggering. Cole had not simply written a defensive strategy. He had reimagined the entire way humanity defended its borders. He had studied Valoran attack patterns for years, identified their assumptions, and built a doctrine that turned every one of those assumptions into a trap. Every Valoran defeat in the last 6 years, every failed advance, every shattered fleet traced back to a system that one man had built in a quiet room on a carrier ship. His men had offered to nominate him for the highest military honor in the Terran coalition. He had declined. They had offered him command of the entire fleet. He had declined. They had offered him a seat on the governing council. He had declined. Every time he said the same thing: I am more useful here. Sarah closed the file. She stood and walked to her balcony. Below, the city of Ara glowed in the evening light. Somewhere in the palace, in a small room with a narrow bed, the man she had married was probably sitting alone, eating whatever the kitchen had given him, asking no one for anything. Her government had told her this. Marriage was a political tool. They had told her the human would be manageable, a symbol, nothing more, a quiet body to fill a chair beside her throne. They had not told her they were sending her the architect of every defeat her empire had suffered. They had not told her they were sending her the man who had single-handedly rewritten the rules of interstellar war. They had not told her they were sending her someone whose own people considered him irreplaceable and who had walked away from all of it without a word of complaint because someone told him it might save lives. Sarah gripped the railing of the balcony. The metal was cool under her fingers. The evening wind moved through her hair, and he had been nothing but gentle since the moment he arrived. She did not know what to do with that, not yet, but for the first time since the treaty was signed, she felt something shift inside her, something heavy and old beginning very slowly to move. The explosion came at dawn. A Terran freight convoy, 6 unarmed cargo ships carrying grain and medical supplies to a human colony. The border was destroyed in the Nalath corridor. All hands lost. 47 human crew members gone in a flash of light and twisted metal. The wreckage drifted in the dark between stars, silent and broken. The news hit both civilizations like a hammer. Terran diplomats were furious. They called it an act of war. They demanded answers, accountability, justice. Human news channels ran the story on every screen. Footage of the debris field, the names of the dead scrolling across the bottom. People who had barely accepted the peace treaty now screamed for its end. On Ara, the Valoran Council went into emergency session. Voices overlapped. Accusations flew. Some council members insisted it was a pirate attack, rogue elements operating in the border systems, but others pointed toward a more calculated ploy. The evidence was still thin, but the political fallout was growing. One thing was clear: the explosion would not be forgotten, and the frontier between two civilizations remained as tenuous as ever. Others suggested it was a Terran false flag designed to make the Valorans look guilty and justify a new war. Queen Sarah sat at the head of the table, listening. Her face revealed nothing, but her mind was working fast. The peace was fragile. It had been fragile since the day it was signed, and now someone had taken a knife to its thinnest thread. Cole was not at the council meeting. He had not been invited. But he had seen the reports, every piece of data the Valorans had made public, plus a few pieces they had not, courtesy of old contacts in the Terran intelligence network who still sent him updates out of habit and loyalty. He sat in his small room staring at the debris analysis on a borrowed data pad. His eyes moved slowly across the data. Energy signatures, blast patterns, fragment trajectories. He read them the way a musician reads sheet music, seeing not just the notes but the song they formed, and the song was wrong. Pirate weapons left a specific energy signature, dirty, uneven, the mark of cheap reactors and salvaged parts. The debris from the Nath corridor showed something different. The blast patterns were clean, precise, military grade, and the energy signature carried a specific frequency modulation that Cole recognized instantly because he had spent a decade studying it on the other end of a targeting scope. These were Valoran weapons, not pirate weapons, not Terran weapons, Valoran military grade. Ordnance fired from Valoran military grade systems. Someone inside the Valorian military had destroyed that convoy. Cole sat very still for a long time, then he began to work. He cross-referenced the blast patterns with known Valoran weapons platforms. He narrowed the signature to a specific class of destroyer, the Kelvari class, which was assigned exclusively to the Third Fleet. He checked deployment logs that had been included in the public record of the investigation and found that a Kelvari class destroyer had been reported on training maneuvers near the Nalath corridor on the day of the attack. Third Fleet was commanded by War Commander Draven. Cole organized his findings into a clear, simple document. No opinions, no accusations, just data laid out in logical order, each point leading inevitably to the next. Then he stood up, put on his formal robe, and walked to the council chamber. He arrived uninvited. The guards at the door hesitated. He was technically the royal consort. They were not sure if they were allowed to stop him. Before they could decide, he was already past them. Council fell silent as Cole walked to the center of the room. Every eye turned to him. Some were hostile, some were curious, some were simply confused. Human had never spoken in this chamber. Most of them had forgotten he was even in the palace. Forgive the interruption, Cole said. His voice was quiet, but in the silence of the chamber it carried to every corner. I have information relevant to the Nalath corridor attack. He placed his data pad on the central table and activated the holographic display. Point by point he walked the council through his analysis. The energy signatures, the blast patterns, the frequency modulation unique to Valoran military systems, the Kelvari class destroyer, the training maneuvers that placed it in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. He did not raise his voice. He did not point fingers. He simply laid out the truth and let it speak. The council chamber was deathly quiet when he finished. Then a chair scraped back violently. War Commander Draven stood, his massive frame towering over the table. His iron dark face was twisted with rage. You dare, he said, his voice shaking the air. You dare stand in this chamber, a human, an outsider creature we allowed to breathe our air, and accuse a commander of the Valoran Fleet. Cole looked up at him. Draven was nearly twice his size. It did not seem to matter. I accuse no one, Cole said. Evenly, the data speaks for itself. I am simply presenting it. Draven slammed his fist on the table, the crystal surface cracked. You are a liar, a manipulator. You planted this evidence to weaken our military and protect your own kind. Cole said nothing. He simply stood there calm and still while Draven raged. Then Draven did something that changed everything. He invoked the right of Velier, a Valoran honor duel, an ancient tradition that allowed any dispute to be settled through personal combat. It was rarely used in modern times, but it was still legal, still binding, and still recognized by the council. If you believe your words, Draven said, his lips curling into a sneer, then stand behind them, face me in the arena of echoes, or admit you are a coward and let your lies die with your silence. The council erupted. Members shouted objections. Lady Nereth rose from her seat, her face pale. Sarah leaned forward on her throne, her amber eyes burning. A Valoran honor duel between a war commander and a human was not just dangerous, it was supposed to be impossible. No human had ever entered the arena of Echo. Cole waited for the noise to die down, then he looked at Draven. I accept, he said. The arena of Echoes was carved into the bedrock beneath the palace. It was a circular pit 50 m across with walls of dark stone that absorbed sound and reflected it back in strange overlapping waves. The acoustics were designed so that every movement, every breath, every footstep echoed and layered upon itself. It was disorienting by design. Valoran warriors trained for years to fight in it. Cole had never set foot in it before. The stands filled quickly. Word had spread through the palace, the city, and eventually the planet. The human consort was going to fight War Commander Draven in single combat. It was the most talked about event on Ara in a generation. Valoran nobles packed the upper tiers. Military officers filled the lower section. Servants crowded the doorways. Sarah sat in the royal box above the arena floor, her hands resting on the arms of her chair, her knuckles white. Lady Nith stood beside her. This is madness, she whispered. Draven will kill him. Sarah said nothing. Her eyes were fixed on the arena floor. Draven entered. First, he was enormous, 8 ft of muscle and fury, carrying a traditional Valoran combat staff that weighed more than Cole's entire body. His iron-dark skin gleamed under the arena lights. He moved with the confidence of someone who had never lost a fight in his life. Cole entered from the opposite side. He wore simple clothes. He carried nothing. He had been offered a weapon and had declined. He had been offered armor and had declined. He walked to the center of the arena with the same quiet, steady steps he used for everything. The crowd murmured, some laughed, a few looked away, unwilling to watch what they assumed would be a slaughter. The signal sounded. Draven roared and charged. It was a terrifying sight, a wall of muscle and rage moving at a speed that should not have been possible for something so large. He swung the combat staff in a wide arc aimed at Cole's head, a blow that would have shattered bone and ended the fight in a single strike. Cole was not there. He had moved not backward, not to the side, but forward, stepping inside Draven's reach at the exact moment the swing committed. It was a move that required either perfect timing or complete insanity. Draven's staff whistled over Cole's head, missing by inches. Cole struck Draven's lead knee with the heel of his boot, not hard enough to break it, hard enough to buckle it. Draven stumbled. For one fraction of a second, his center of gravity was wrong. That was all Cole needed. He grabbed Draven's staff arm, used the commander's own momentum to twist him off balance, and drove his elbow into the nerve cluster at the base of Draven's neck, a spot that was identical in Valoran and human anatomy. Because Cole had studied Valoran physiology for years during the war. Draven went down. His staff clattered across the stone floor. Cole stepped on it, pinning it, and placed his foot lightly on Draven's chest. 11 seconds. The entire fight had lasted 11 seconds. The arena was completely silent. Thousands of Valorans stared in disbelief. Draven lay on the ground, gasping, unable to understand what had just happened. Cole looked down at him. There was no anger in his face, no triumph, just the same calm patience he carried everywhere. He picked up Draven's staff and offered it to him. Handle first. The war is over, Commander, Cole said quietly. Let it stay over. Draven stared at the offered weapon. His hand trembled. He did not take it. Then from the upper tier of the arena, a sound broke the silence, a single pair of hands clapping slowly. Cole looked up. An elderly Valoran woman in a retired general's uniform stood in the front row. Her name was General Yavin. She had commanded the fleet that Cole had defeated at Corvan Ridge. She had lost 3 ships and 2,000 soldiers to his tactics. She was clapping for him. Others followed, not all of them, not even most of them, but enough. Scattered, uncertain applause that grew slowly like rain beginning to fall. Not celebration, recognition, the sound of warriors acknowledging something they could not deny. In the royal box, Sarah sat motionless, her composure the mask she had worn every day of her reign had cracked. Her lips were slightly parted. Her eyes were wide. She was not looking at a political tool. She was not looking at a symbol or a transaction. She was looking at a man who had carried the weight of an entire war on his shoulders, who had been sent alone into the heart of enemy territory, who had endured months of contempt and isolation without complaint, and who had just defeated one of the most dangerous warriors in her empire in 11 seconds, and then offered him his weapon back. Something inside her chest tightened. Something she had not felt in a very long time. She did not have a word for it yet, but it was there, and it was real, and it was not going away. Draven was arrested the following morning. His personal files were seized. His communications were opened. What the investigators found was worse than anyone had expected. The Nalith corridor attack was not a single act of rage. It was the first step in a carefully planned conspiracy to restart the war. Draven had been building a network of loyalists inside the Valoran military. For months, he had contacts in 3 border fleets, agents planted in the diplomatic corps, and a timeline that mapped out a series of escalating incidents designed to make peace impossible. Cole's evidence had not just stopped one attack, it had exposed an entire operation. The Valoran Council held an emergency tribunal. Draven was stripped of his rank, his honors, and his name. In Valorian culture, that last punishment was the most severe. To lose your name was to be erased from history. He was taken from the palace in silence, and the doors closed behind him. No one spoke his name again. The Terran coalition received a full briefing on the conspiracy for the first time since the treaty was signed. Human diplomats and Valoran officials stood in the same room and spoke. Honestly, the anger over the Naleth corridor was not gone, but it had been redirected away from the Valoran people and toward the individuals responsible. The peace held barely, but it held. Cole received messages from the Terran coalition thanking him for his role. There were offers of medals, commendations, interview requests from every major human news network. He ignored all of them. He closed the messages, set the data pad aside, and went for a walk in the palace gardens. It was there that Sarah found him. She had been looking for him for an hour. She had checked his quarters, the council chamber, the dining hall. She had even sent Lady Nath to search the engineering wing, half expecting to find him fixing something. Instead, he was sitting on a stone bench beneath a tree, with pale blue leaves, watching a small fountain send water into the air in slow spiraling patterns. Sarah stopped a few steps away. She had never sought out his company before. Every previous interaction between them had been formal, scheduled, structured, surrounded by other people. This was different. This was just the two of them, alone in a garden that smelled like rain. "May I sit?" she asked. Cole looked up. If he was surprised, he did not show it. He moved slightly to make room on the bench, and the Queen of 32 Star System sat down beside him like an ordinary person, resting her feet. For a while, neither of them spoke. Fountain murmured. The blue leaves rustled in a warm breeze. Somewhere in the distance, a bird or whatever the Valoran equivalent was saying a short, repeating melody. "You could have killed him," Sarah said finally. She was talking about Draven in the arena. "You had the opportunity." "I know," Cole said. "Why didn't you?" Cole watched the fountain. "Because killing him would have proven everything he said about humans, that we are violent, that we destroy what we do not understand." He paused. "Beating him was enough. Letting him live made the point better than his death ever could." Sarah studied his profile. The lines around his eyes, the quiet set of his jaw, the way his hands rested on his knees, still patient, the hands of a man who had learned long ago that the most important thing in any battle was knowing when not to fight. "Tell me about the photograph," she said. Cole was quiet for a moment, then he reached into his pocket he had taken to carrying it with him and pulled out the creased picture. He held it gently, the way you hold something that might dissolve if you press too hard. "My wife," he said. "Her name was Katie, and my son Liam. He was 5 in this picture." He looked at the image. "Our colony was called Briars Landing. It was a farming settlement on a small world near the border. Nothing strategic, nothing valuable, but it was in the way, and the Third Fleet needed." The corridor cleared. Sarah felt something cold settle in her chest. She knew what he was going to say. "They hit us at night," Cole said. His voice did not change. It stayed level and calm, the way it always was, but there was something beneath it, something vast and heavy, held carefully in place by years of practice. "Katie got Liam into the shelter. I was in the fields. By the time I got back, the shelter had taken a direct hit." He looked at the photograph. "I found this in the rubble. It was the only thing left. The garden was very quiet. I enlisted the next day," he said. "Not because I wanted revenge. I thought I did at first, but it wasn't that. I knew what it felt like to lose everything. And I didn't want anyone else to feel it." Not our people, not yours, not anyone. Sarah did not speak. For a long time, she sat beside this man, who had lost his family to her empires. War machine who had spent 11 years fighting the people who had taken everything from him and who had then agreed to marry their queen and walk alone into their world because someone told him it might save lives. She understood now. She understood all of it. I am sorry, she said. The words were simple, but the way she said them was not. There was no politics in her voice, no diplomacy, just a woman sitting beside a man telling him she was sorry for what he had lost. Cole nodded. He put the photograph back in his pocket. Thank you, he said. They sat together until the suns began to set, painting the sky in shades of violet and copper. They talked not about politics or war or treaties. He told her about rain on Briar's Landing, how it smelled like cut grass and warm earth. She told him about the singing tides of Athera's northern ocean, how the water made sound at dusk that her people believed was the voice of the planet itself. He asked her about the blue leaf tree above them. She told him its name and that it only bloomed once every 40 years. He said he hoped he would be around to see it. She looked at him when he said that. He was not making a grand statement. He was just a man sitting under a tree hoping he would get to see it bloom. Something in her heart moved. Not the careful, controlled movement of a queen making a decision. Something deeper. Something that had nothing to do with thrones or treaties. In the weeks that followed, everything changed, not suddenly but steadily, the way a river changes the shape of stone. Cole began attending council meetings, not as a silent observer, but as an active voice. Sarah invited him to speak. The council resisted at first, but his contributions were too valuable to ignore. He proposed a joint trade framework between human and Valoran merchants that reduced tariffs on both sides and opened new markets that benefited everyone. He suggested a joint military academy. Young officers from both species could train together and build trust before old hatreds had time to take root. He worked harder than anyone in the palace. He was the first to arrive at meetings and the last to leave. He met with engineers, diplomats, merchants, and soldiers. He listened more than he spoke. He never raised his voice. He never demanded credit. When asked who had designed the new trade framework, he said, the council designed it. I just helped with the numbers. The Valoran people began to notice, not all at once, and not all of them warmly, but the story of the arena spread far beyond the palace. Children in the streets of Athera began playing a game they called 11 Seconds. Veterans who had fought against Cole during the war started visiting the palace, not to confront him but to meet him. Some of them shook his hand. Others simply stood in the corridor and watched him pass, quiet and thoughtful. His old soldiers had called him the Quiet Wall. Now slowly the Valorans began to use that name too. Lady Nurith, who had once watched him with suspicion, now sought his advice regularly. She told him one evening that she had never met anyone who worked so hard and wanted so little in return. Cole shrugged and said, I just want the peace to last longer than I do. As for Sarah, the queen who had entered this marriage expecting a political inconvenience, she found herself with something she had never had before. A partner, not a subordinate who obeyed her, not a rival who challenged her. A partner who stood beside her, who told her the truth even when it was hard, who respected her strength without being intimidated by it, and who made her laugh in a way she had not laughed since she was a girl. One evening in her private chambers, after a long day of negotiations with 3 different planetary governments, Sarah sat across from Cole. They had been reviewing documents together, something that had become their routine. The work was finished, but neither of them moved to leave. Sarah reached across the table and took his hand. Cole looked at their hands, hers long-fingered, elegant, his smaller, rough, scarred across the knuckles. He did not pull away. "You are not beside my throne," she said quietly. "You are beside me." Cole looked at her for the first time since he had arrived on Ara. Something in his eyes softened. The tiredness was still there, but beneath it something else appeared. Something warm and alive, like light, finding its way through a crack in a wall that had been sealed for a very long time. He squeezed her hand gently. "Then that is where I will stay," he said. Months later, a galactic news broadcast aired across both human and Valoran networks. A journalist reported on the unprecedented period of peace between the 2 civilizations. Trade had doubled, military tensions had dropped to their lowest levels in decades. A joint colony had been established on a neutral world, the first shared settlement between the 2 species. Over footage of Cole and Sarah walking together through the colony's dedication ceremony, her tall and radiant, him steady and quiet at her side. The anchor noted that most political marriages faded into footnotes in history books, but this one, the anchor said, had become something no one expected. This one had built something real. The broadcast ended with an interview. An old Valoran woman sat in a garden on a retired officer's estate. She wore no uniform, but her bearing told you everything. She was General Ivan, the woman who had clapped first in the arena, the commander who had lost her fleet to Cole Beckett at Corvan Ridge. The interviewer asked her what she thought of the human consort. Yan smiled. It was a small, quiet smile, the kind earned by someone who had seen enough of the galaxy to know what mattered and what did not. "We spent 11 years trying to break that man," she said, "threw everything we had at him. Every fleet, every weapon, every strategy our empire could build." She paused and looked out over the garden, where blue leaf trees swayed in the wind. "We should have known. You cannot break a wall by throwing yourself against it. You can only be glad when it decides to shelter you instead." The screen faded to black, and across the galaxy, in a palace on a world of crystal towers and singing tides, a quiet man from a burned colony held the hand of a queen, and the stars were at peace.